Chicago, Part 1.
Table of Contents, Chicago, Part 1.
Chicagoland is a vast metropolitan area at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, extending into nearby Indiana and Wisconsin. Learn about this economic powerhouse and why it's called the Windy City, all about Chicago, with visiting and touring information, geography, history, attractions, and other points of interest.
Dr. Sidney Soclof. drsydney22@gmail.com. 2023. Narration by Dr. Sidney Soclof.
Zoe Phonemes.
And Nathan Koltov. For a complete discussion of YouTube navigation, please go to tiny.1/ytnavigator. The Great Lakes. Chicago. Chicago is on the Great Lakes at the southern end of Lake Michigan.
The Greater Chicagoland area, which encompasses northeastern Illinois and extends into southeastern Wisconsin and northwestern Indiana, is the country's third largest metropolitan area and the dominant metropolis of the Midwest.
Chicago sprawls along the lakeshore of Lake Michigan. At its greatest extent, the city is some 25 miles, 40 kilometers, from north to south and 15 miles, 25 kilometers, from east to west, with an area of 228 square miles. The population of the Chicago-Joliet-Naperville metropolitan area is 9.5 million. The Chicago metropolitan area, often called Chicagoland, is the third most populous in the United States and number 4 in North America. This shows the various districts of Chicago. The Navy Pier and downtown area is in the Loop and near North Side.
Chicago is the birthplace of the skyscraper and perhaps the most influential architectural city of the 20th century.
Chicago saw the creation of the first standardized futures contracts at the Chicago Board of Trade, established in 1848. It is one of the world's oldest futures and options exchanges. It merged with the Chicago Mercantile Exchange in 2007 and now generates 20% of all volume in commodities and financial futures. The history of Chicago. Fort Dearborn was built in 1803 beside the Chicago River. The original fort was destroyed during the War of 1812, and a new fort was constructed on the same site in 1816. By 1837, the fort had been decommissioned. Parts of the fort were lost to the widening of the Chicago River in 1855 and a fire in 1857. The last vestiges of Fort Dearborn were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire of 1871. Chicago was incorporated as a city in 1837 near Portage between the Great Lakes and the Mississippi River watershed and grew rapidly in the mid-19th century.
The original site for Chicago was unremarkable, a small settlement at the mouth of the Chicago River near the southern tip of Lake Michigan. A common notion for the origin of the city's name is an Algonquin word for a wild leek, or onion, plant that grew locally. However, Chicago's location at the southwestern end of the vast Great Lakes system could not have been more ideal as the country expanded westward in the 19th century. Perhaps this is reflected in another interpretation of the Native American term meaning strong or great.
Regardless of which derivation is correct, it was soon recognized that the Chicago River formed a critical link in the Great Waterway that arose mid-century between the Atlantic Ocean and the Mississippi River. With the rise of railways soon after that, the young city became the country's railway hub, which helped diversify the city's rapidly growing industrial base. Chicago continued as America's crossroads with the explosive growth of air travel after World War II. After the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, which destroyed several square miles and left more than 100,000 homeless, the city made a concerted effort to rebuild.
The construction boom accelerated population growth throughout the following decades, and by 1900, Chicago was one of the 5 largest cities in the world.
During this period, Chicago made noted contributions to urban planning and zoning standards, which included creating new construction styles, including the Chicago School of Architecture, the development of the City Beautiful movement, and the steel-framed skyscraper. Chicago's rapid growth in the 19th century led to a reputation not only for disorder and political corruption, but also for creativity in the arts, architecture, and business. The cultures of virtually every country can be found in food stores, restaurants, clothing shops, music and video dealers, places of worship, and street corner conversations.
Chicago never fulfilled its dream of becoming the largest American city, but between 1890 and 1982, it was second only to New York City. That fact has contributed much to the city's reputed personality in the 19th century. It had the image of being aggressive and self-promoting, stealing population and businesses from the East. Poet Carl Sandburg hailed Chicago as cunning and cruel yet creative and strangely attractive. It was the Toddlin' Town of the 1920s tune, and Frank Sinatra famously proclaimed it my kind of town. Carl Sandburg's most famous description of the city is as hog butcher for the world, tool maker, stacker of wheat, player with railroads and the nation's freight handler, stormy, husky, brawling, city of the big shoulders.
Positioned along Lake Michigan, Chicago is an international hub for finance, commerce, industry, technology, telecommunications, and transportation. O'Hare International Airport is one of the busiest airports in the world, and the region also has the largest number of U.S. highways and railroad freight.
Chicago is ranked in the top 10 of the wealthiest cities in the world in terms of gross metropolitan product. It is in 8th place with a GDP of $525 billion.
The city has one of the world's largest and most diversified and balanced economies, not dependent on any one industry. No single industry in Chicago employs more than 14% of the workforce. Chicago was the 3rd most visited city in the United States with almost 50 million domestic and international visitors, behind the 47 million tourists to New York City and the 46 million to the Orlando area.
Chicago ranked first place in the 2018 Time Out City Life Index, a global quality of life survey of 32 cities. It was one of the happiest and proudest cities worldwide, falling short only on safety.
There are many colleges and universities in the Chicago area, of which the University of Chicago and the University of Illinois at Chicago are classified as highest research doctoral universities. The Chicago River has 38 movable bridges spanning it.
The bridges open occasionally to let boats through. The reversal of the flow of the Chicago River.
When the first European settlers arrived, the Chicago River flowed sluggishly into Lake Michigan from Chicago's flat plain.
Most rivers flowed into Lake Michigan before 1900. As Chicago grew, sewage and other pollution flowed increasingly into the lake, which also served as the clean water source for the city, contributing to several public health problems.
In 1900, the flow of the Chicago River was completely reversed using a series of canal locks, causing it to empty into the newly completed Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal and then into sewage treatment facilities.
100 years later, in 1999, this system was named a Civil Engineering Monument of the Millennium by the American Society of Civil Engineers.
Before this time, the Chicago River was known by many residents of Chicago as the Stinking River because of the massive amounts of sewage and pollution that poured into the river from Chicago's booming industrial economy.
The flow of the Chicago River was reversed to now flow away from the lake and through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The buildings and architecture of Chicago have both influenced and reflected the history of American architecture, with many prominent buildings in a variety of styles by many influential architects. What two, or maybe three, innovations made the modern skyscraper possible?
Structural steel framework. The elevato, most specifically. The Otis safety elevato. The telephone.
Since most structures within the downtown area were destroyed by the Great Chicago Fire in 1871, the most famous exception being the Water Tower. Chicago buildings are noted for their originality rather than their antiquity.
Chicago is world famous for its numerous unique architectural styles. From Chicago bungalows and two flats to the grand greystones along Logan Boulevard and Lawndale Avenue. And from the skyscrapers of the Loop to sacred architecture, such as the city's ornate Polish cathedrals.
Skyscrapers.
Chicago's architecture is famous throughout the world, and one style is referred to as the Chicago School, also known as the commercial style. The home insurance building was designed by William Lee Barangeni in 1884. It is considered to be the first skyscraper,
and the first tall building to be supported inside and outside by a fireproof structural steel frame, including reinforced concrete.
The Reliance Building is at 1 West Washington Street in the Loop area of Chicago, Illinois. It was designed by John Root and Charles B. Atwood in the period 1890 to 1895. It is the first skyscraper to have large plate glass windows make up most of its surface area. The first Chicago School were architects active in Chicago at the turn of the 20th century. They were among the first to promote the new technologies of steel frame construction in commercial buildings. A second Chicago School later emerged in the 1940s and 1970s, which pioneered new building technologies and structural systems such as the tube frame structure. The Chicago Building by Halliburton Roche, 1904 to 1905, is a prime example of the Chicago School, displaying both variations of the Chicago window. The Brooks Building in Chicago was built from 1909 to 1910 and is an early example of a steel-framed skyscraper in the Chicago School architectural style. Lewis Henry Sullivan, 1856 to 1924, was an influential architect considered by many as the creator of the modern skyscraper, and a member of the Chicago School. Other architects associated with the Chicago School include Henry Hobson Richardson, Dankmer Edler, Daniel Burnham, William Halliburton, William LeBron, Jenny Martin Roche, John Root, and Solon S. B. Mutton.
The 1893 World's Columbian Exposition is also known as the Chicago World's Fair and Chicago Columbian Exposition.
The World's Columbian Exposition was a World's Fair held in Chicago in 1893 to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492.
Chicago won out over New York City, Washington, D.C. and St. Louis for the honor of hosting the fair.
The exposition was an influential social and cultural event and had a profound effect on architecture, sanitation, the arts, Chicago's self-image, and American industrial optimism.
The layout of the Chicago Columbian Exposition was, in large part, designed by prominent architects Root, Burnham, Olmsted and Atwood. It was the prototype of what Burnham and his colleagues thought a city should be. It was designed to follow Beaux-Arts principles of design, namely French neoclassical architectural principles based on symmetry, balance, and splendor.
The color of the material generally used to cover the building's facades gave the fairgrounds its nickname. The White City. Artists and musicians were featured in exhibits, and many also made depictions and works of art inspired by the exposition.
The exposition covered of its 600 acres, 2.4 square kilometers, featuring nearly 200 new but deliberately temporary buildings of predominantly neoclassical architecture, canals and lagoons, and people and cultures from 46 countries. More than 27 million people attended the exposition during its 6-month run. Its scale and grandeur far exceeded the other World's Fairs.
Dedication ceremonies for the fair were held on October 21, 1892, but the fairgrounds were not open to the public until May 1, 1893. The fair continued until October 30, 1893. In addition to recognizing the 400th anniversary of the discovery of the New World by Europeans, the fair also served to show the world that Chicago had risen from the ashes of the Great Chicago Fire, which had destroyed much of the city in 1871.
On October 9, 1893, the day designated as Chicago Day, the fair set the world record for outdoor event attendance, drawing 751,000 people. The debt for the fair was soon paid off with a check for $1.5 million, equivalent to $55 million today. This is a bird's eye view of the fairgrounds in 1893. This is a replica of Daniel Chester French's Statue of the Republic at the site of the World's Columbian Exposition.
Sports in Chicago include many professional sports teams. Chicago is one of 10 U.S. cities with teams from the 5 major American professional team sports: baseball, football, basketball, hockey, soccer. Chicago has been named the best sports city by Sporting News 3 times in 1993, 2006 and 2010.
The Chicago Bears football team has its home games at Soldier Field.
This is Soldier Field, home of the Chicago Bears football team. The Chicago Cubs play at Wrigley Field, and the White Sox are at Guaranteed Rate Field. This is Wrigley Field, home of the Chicago Cubs.
The Chicago Bulls basketball team has its home games at the United Center.
The Chicago Blackhawks hockey team plays at the United Center.
The Chicago Fire soccer team has its home games at Toyota Park.
Chicago Union Station opened in 1925 and is the third busiest passenger rail terminal in the United States. This is an Amtrak train on the Empire Builder route departing Chicago from Union Station. O'Hare International Airport is the world's sixth busiest airport, serving 80 million passengers last year. O'Hare is unusual because it serves as a major hub for 3 U.S. mainline carriers. O'Hare International Airport is United Airlines' largest hub and American Airlines' third largest hub, as well as a major airport for Frontier and Spirit Airlines. It is good to have some points of reference when visiting Chicago. This is the downtown area of Chicago. The Loop is the term used for the central business district and downtown area of Chicago. It is believed that the word loop originated with the elevated railway that encircled this area.
This is the Chicago metropolitan area.
This is a map of the top tourist attractions in Chicago.
This is a map of the downtown area of Chicago. This is a map of the central downtown area of Chicago.
The Chicago Portage connects the navigable waterways connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. This makes it one of the most strategic points in the interior of North America.
The saddle point of the gap is within the city of Chicago, and the Chicago Portage is the reason Chicago exists. It has developed to become the immensely important city that it is today.
This shows the watersheds of North America. We see that Chicago straddles the divide between the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River watershed and the Mississippi-Missouri Basin. Here is the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence watershed, with Chicago right at its edge. This is the Mississippi-Missouri drainage basin.
And we note the proximity of Chicago to the Des Plaines River, a tributary of the Illinois River which flows into the Mississippi River.
This shows how the Illinois and Des Plaines rivers are now connected to Lake Michigan through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal.
This shows how the Illinois and Des Plaines rivers are now connected to Lake Michigan through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. The Illinois and Michigan Canal crossed the Chicago Portage and helped establish Chicago as the transportation hub of the United States before the railroad era.
The Illinois and Michigan Canal was in operation from 1848 to 1900 when it was largely replaced by the wider and shorter Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal. It ceased transportation operations with the completion of the Illinois Waterway in 1933.
The Illinois and Michigan Canal locks and towpath is a collection of 8 engineering structures and segments of the canal between Lockport and LaSalle, Peru, and was designated a National Historic Landmark in 1964. Portions of the canal have been filled in, and much of the former canal has been preserved as part of the Illinois and Michigan Canal National Heritage Corridor.
Chicago Waterways.
Chicago is now open to shipping from the Atlantic Ocean via the St. Lawrence Seaway and the Great Lakes to the heartland of America and the Gulf of Mexico. This shows the various waterways in the Chicago area.
Note that none of these waterways empty into Lake Michigan.
This is a map of the inland waterways in both ocean and inland ports of the United States. Note the key role of Chicago in this system.
Railroads to Chicago.
This shows the straight-line coast-to-coast route between the great ports of New York City and San Francisco. We see that both Cleveland and Chicago are almost directly on that route.
Later by the 1850s, the railroads followed the canal routes and the shore of Lake Erie to go from New York and the East Coast to Buffalo, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, and then Chicago. Later the rail lines were extended from Chicago to Omaha, and then in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed to San Francisco. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869 from Omaha to San Francisco, thus linking Chicago to the West Coast. Two essential ingredients in producing iron and steel are iron ore and coal. Coal can be shipped to Chicago from the Pennsylvania and West Virginia mines by rail and iron ore from the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota by ship. This is a United States steel plant in Gary, Indiana, where iron ore from Minnesota meets coal from Pennsylvania and West Virginia.
Chicago, with its direct rail links, is also the ideal location for the distribution of agricultural produce from the agricultural heartland of the country to the cities in the highly populated East Coast. Beef is a highly perishable commodity, especially in the days before refrigeration. With its direct rail links, Chicago is the ideal place for cattle from the southern plains in Texas to be processed into beef for rapid shipment to the cities in the highly populated East Coast.
In the 1890s, over 2 million animals per year came into the Union stockyards. With the rise of railways soon after that, Chicago became the country's railway hub, which helped diversify the city's rapidly growing industrial base.
Thus, Chicago became the nexus of the water, rail and highway transportation network, and eventually a central airline hub. In 1948 and 1949, America's railroads celebrated the 100th anniversary of the first train to operate in Chicago with a grand public exhibition of their history and progress.
This shows the railroads in the United States in 1850 and 1860. Note the concentration of railroads in Chicago.
This shows the railroads in the United States in 1870. The Transcontinental Railroad was completed in 1869.
This shows the railroads in the United States in 1890. Note again the nexus of railroads in Chicago. This network map from 1999 shows Chicago's central position in rail traffic. The Chicago Union Station opened in 1925 and is the third busiest passenger rail terminal in the United States. This is an Amtrak train on the Empire Builder route departing Chicago from Union Station. Air transport.
Chicago's O'Hare Airport was the world's busiest from 1963 to 1998. Now it is the sixth busiest airport in the world and the third in the U.S., with 80 million passengers annually.
We see that Chicago is the airport with the most flight routes in the U.S.
This shows the location of the major airports of O'Hare and Midway in the Chicago area. O'Hare International Airport is 14 miles, 23 kilometers, northwest of the Loop Business District. O'Hare has direct flights to 217 destinations worldwide.
O'Hare Airport has 8 runways that allow for 2,700 operations per day.
O'Hare International Airport is the world's sixth busiest airport, serving 80 million passengers last year.
O'Hare serves as a major hub for 3 U.S. mainline carriers. It is United Airlines' largest hub and the third largest hub for American Airlines and a major airport for Frontier and Spirit Airlines. Chicago Midway International Airport is 8 miles, 13 kilometers, southwest of the Loop. Established in 1927, Midway served as Chicago's primary airport until the opening of O'Hare in 1955. Midway Airport was renamed to honor the Battle of the Midway in 1942. Midway is the second largest airport in the Chicago area, serving 22 million passengers a year.
Table of Contents, Chicago, Part 1. This is continued in Chicago, Part 2.